In this video, we'll take a close look at a few buildings by the architect Louis Kahn, as they offer an important contribution for rethinking architecture after the modern movement had run its course. In particular, after decades of architects attacking the room,
that the box was a fascist symbol and that the architecture of freedom and democracy needed something beside the box.
Kahn works to bring rooms back in fresh new ways that retain the spirit of modernism's open interpretation of space, while at the same time creating privacy, enclosure, and even monumentality. Stay tuned. Hello, my name is Stewart Hicks, and I lead design studio and lecture courses at the University of Illinois in Chicago. I have this joke of an armchair theory that one should always visit important buildings with your loved ones, because otherwise you risk having life-altering experiences that change you on some molecular level. And if those close to you aren't exposed to the same experiences, you might find yourself on some other wavelength, unable to have meaningful connections anymore or shared experiences of any kind. Luckily, I was with my partner Allison Newmeyer when I visited the Exeter Library by Louis Kahn, and we've evolved together ever since. The photos that we took while we were there poked fun at the phenomena of people thinking that buildings and their architects are mysterious constructions and gurus, and we captured Allison stroking the materials of the building in wonder and in amazement. While my theory is purely a joke that helps underscore the strange ways that we sometimes talk about architecture, I do honestly find that architecture can provoke strong emotions and experiences like a good film, like a song, or a poem. However, I try to be careful not to overprivilege the mystical language and attribution of value to buildings and architects. One reason is that it's kind of imprecise and vague. But secondly, it perpetuates a myth that architecture is created by mysterious geniuses that transcend humanity in some way. This tendency does everyone a disservice for a host of different reasons. And if you'd like a taste of Louis Kahn as a human, I suggest that you go watch the movie My Architect: A Son's Journey. Architecture doesn't spring up and spontaneously in a vacuum, as a pure vision from one single individual. It is planned, it's agonized over, it's edited, and touched by dozens of contributing authors. For instance, the Trenton Bath House was built in 1955 as locker rooms for a larger bath complex. It's a masterpiece that seems so simple at the outset, but its complexity is magnified and the more that you experience and that you study it. It's like a song that seems like it always existed, and the Trenton Bath House is a distillation of ideas into a precise and almost obvious configuration that seems to provoke almost infinite depths of understanding. However, the plan for the bathhouse has actually been attributed to Anne Ting, the powerhouse architect and longtime collaborator of Louis Kahn. And I think that this fact underscores just how misleading that the single mystical author model of architectural attribution can be. But anyway, Louis Kahn started his architectural practice in 1935. Though most of his work, like the Trenton Bath House, comes after World War II, an event that shook the world and architecture in fundamental and profound ways that I think are important to contextualize. Prior to World War II, architecture in the West was largely defined by modernism, where faith was placed in the advancement of science and technology to directly lead to a more advanced and a healthy society. Architects wanted the built environment to participate in this zeitgeist, so they considered how buildings might be presented like pieces of technology, and slogans like "a house is a machine for living in" are catchy evidence of this. Of course, this is a bit of an oversimplification, but either way, science and technology after World War II are now seen as possible instruments of war and death and destruction. The buildings born from the celebration of these seem dehumanizing and ill-conceived all of a sudden. I've made a few videos on architects working prior to World War II that developed various forms of open concepts, which I'll link in the upper right corner. The first video was on Frank Lloyd Wright, who used language that he wanted to attack the room. At the time, rooms seemed like the enemy, and their dissolution was essential to the advancement of the modern movement. After World War II, Louis Kahn's work reconsidered this attack in order to rediscover what rooms could offer. What architectural opportunities are left behind when we left behind the room? While this sounds overly simplistic, sometimes going back to the basics, we can rethink one's approach to the most fundamental level and can yield the greatest and most profound awards. One of the most distilled examples of this quest is his design for that bathhouse in Trenton, New Jersey. And it's basically a couple of open-air locker rooms and changing rooms for a nearby pool. Kahn would talk about buildings as societies of rooms, and the Trenton Bath House might be considered 4 rooms arranged in such a way so as to imply a 5th one at its center. Each room is actually like a separate pavilion that could easily exist on its own, but that also lives in a society with other pavilions, all the while making the most of its relationship to its neighbors. Each pavilion has a common underlying structure, a square grid with 5 squares per side with solid squares at the corners. The walls that define the pavilion line up with the outside walls of the solid corners, but on one side of each locker room, the wall is brought into the middle of one of those square bays. This opens up the square at the edges for the entrances to the interior rooms, and this configuration provides visual privacy for the changing rooms inside. At the same time, it calls into question the role of structure in the building and how people might participate with that structure. The squares of the corners of each pavilion appear to be solid, heavy, massive columns, but really they're just passages for people into the locker rooms. In fact, the roof of the buildings actually sits elevated off the columns entirely, so their exaggerated size is clearly not for structural purposes. And the center of the structure is actually a place for the human body to occupy. The structure is not solid with material like we'd find in examples from other modern architects. Each pavilion is aligned with others so that these exaggerated columns occupy the same row within the grid. So when we draw lines to reveal the hierarchy within the overall grid, we find that some rows are actually more important than others, or at least that each row is important in its own way. And the distinction between the rooms are called servant spaces and served spaces. Some zones exist to support other zones. And while this concept existed before the work of Kahn's office, here we find it elevated to become a primary organizing and architectural principle. Overall, the configuration also calls into question whether it's entirely accurate to think of it as 4 separate structures next to one another. The alignment also looks like it might be about having 9 pavilions with 5 of them taken away at the corners and at the center. This understanding leads us to think that the process was more about subtracting rooms than it was really about adding them. And this kind of ambiguous understanding is a way of using rooms that doesn't only lead to one singular and obvious clear answer, but instead leads to a rich field of possible readings. The Adler House is an unbuilt design that uses the exact same pavilion structure, with the squares and separated pavilions used as rooms in the design for a house. However, in this building, each pavilion no longer fits neatly into the 9-square grid. There's still a vague reference to that grid as an imaginary starting point for the design, but these rooms have been shifted around to produce new kinds of relationships between the parts. I find it pretty fascinating that a building plan can actually hint at these kinds of actions being performed during the design process. This shifting leaves certain squares open, as in the entryway, and the exaggeratedly large columns collect at the corners in groups of 2s and 3s. Other servant elements occupy the ring of space around each pavilion, like the fireplaces and storage cabinets. So with the same element of the square pavilions, we get another kind of use made possible, and another approach to creating the ambiguous configurations that relate to sliding, movement, and the presence or absence of the room pavilion. In subsequent buildings, these ideas show up in different ways yet again. And the Esherick House, for instance, doesn't really use the pavilion idea. It's more of a subdivided rectangle. But it does continue with the servant and served configuration in the plan with alternating stripes. The stripes from right to left on the first floor are the living room, the space for movement, the entry and the stairs, the dining room and foyer area, and then the utilities like the kitchen. On the second floor is an open area to the living room below, then the movement band from the first floor, then the single bedroom, and then the bathing and the closet area all the way to the left. In addition to this compact and clever configuration of servant and served spaces are a few more lessons that show up in other buildings by Kahn. Structurally, the house is made of concrete block with a smooth facing of stucco. This gives the impression that the building is one seamless block of material. However, even through the placement of the windows, this building looks like it's like a single volume that might be fractured into smaller pieces. Or alternatively, that it's distinct blocks that just aren't pushed all the way together. Again, the space between things is in a smart dialogue with the things themselves, so as to create an ambiguous understanding of which is the correct way of understanding it. There are a number of other conditions that recall the Trenton Bath House as well. The walls are turned in to create the illusion that the walls are even thicker than they are. So we might perceive a window cutout as 3 times as thick as the actual construction of the wall. Within this space are things like the storage for books. The client, Margaret Escherich, was actually a bookseller. This space is also used in the bedroom as a seat for people. And again, the perceived thickness of the structure is actually where the inhabitants go. So people in the building fold into the structure and into the walls. There's also a tight script about where the windows go, which ones are operable, which ones get shutters versus which ones get curtains, and whether they sit on the outside of the thickness of the wall zone or on the inside of it. Above that bookshelf that we talked about, a window allows light to flood into the space without directly hitting any of the books, which would damage them. The space between the bookshelves don't have glass, they're just shutters that open up to the outside. The space of the living room is filled with light, but done so in a way that interacts closely with the objects to maintain an optimal relationship. But coincidentally, the address for the house is 204 Sunrise Lane. Finally, to complement the stucco material in the glass is a richly colored and textured wood that makes up the shutters and other important surfaces on the interior. The wood provides a sort of like a liner for the people to touch and to interact with that shelters them from the rough structural materials of the outside. The wood is in the most prominent of the interior spaces, like the staircase, where people are really physically engaging with the building in an intimate way. These approaches and techniques transcend the design of houses and even show up in some of Kahn's largest buildings, like the Exeter Library, built about 15 years after the Esherick House. This building is like taking one of the pavilions from the Trenton Bath House and blowing it way up in size to become a single, giant, monumental room. The library is like a single room, one great space as a container of cultural memory. From the outside, the building is cubic in shape, composed of brick piers with a grid of windows. On the Exeter campus, the library actually is turned so that the entrance faces away from the rest of the campus, so students are encouraged to walk around the building in order to enter. This makes it appear even more monumental, like a stranded objects placed independently from the other buildings nearby. Once visitors do enter, they enter a compact space that is flanked symmetrically with curved staircases. The structural part of the staircase is concrete, but it is lined with a marble called travertine, which provides a richer material for people to actually touch. Once you transcend the stair, you find yourself in the heart of the building, a full-height atrium that stretches all the way to the roof of the multi-story building. The atrium is lined with books on each floor and capped with light that streams in from the windows placed high above. In plan, the building is like a series of rings in the shape of a square donut. Each ring has a role in supporting the library function: spaces for reading, storage of books, circulation, and then the atrium at the heart of it all. The servant and served rings are really easy to distinguish, and the arrangement of the spaces follows a script that Kahn found important. You enter, follow the light to the books, you grab a book, and then you take it to the outside of the building into the light. Hey, psst. Hey kid. Yeah, you. Why don't you grab a book and bring it to the light? You can come and read it in some of my walls. Each window that meets the floor holds a wooden reading carrel, so people grab a book and bring it to one of these carrels and climb in. They get put on display for visitors from the outside to witness their activity. And again, people become part of the structure in the same way that they did in the Trenton Bath House or the Esherick House, folded into the architecture itself. So Louis Kahn and his collaborators inherited a world that didn't know what to do with rooms. All those open, organic, and free plans vilified rooms as antiquated and repressive elements. This laid the groundwork for people to rediscover what rooms could be. Units that live in a society where the arrangement offers ambiguous understandings of exactly what's going on. This ambiguity is welcome, however, and people viewing and interacting with the building are encouraged to dive into them, both intellectually and physically, by sometimes becoming part of the wall itself. His buildings are not monuments to technology. Instead, buildings like the Exeter Library might be considered a monument to the room, specifically a room where human knowledge is stored and accessed with light as your guide. The idea for this video actually came from a suggestion from the comments, so please feel free to leave a comment on what you thought about this one or suggestions for new ones. While you're at it, consider giving the video a like if you did like it, and clicking the subscribe button if you're interested in videos that talk about architecture and the built environment. Thanks everybody, see you later.